talk.
Nice to meet you.
To talk, and then
Thank you so much. I want to thank all my colleagues for being here and all our distinguished panelists. I'm Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney. Last month, the Census Bureau reported that income inequality in the United States, by one measure, had reached its highest level since they began tracking it more than 50 years ago. For the typical worker, wages have been stagnant for decades, for 4 decades. On the other hand, those at the top are doing great. The top 1% of households in the United States now take home about 20% of the total income. The wealthiest 1% own nearly 40% of total wealth. Those at the very top, the top 1/10 of 1%, have seen their share of wealth double since 1990. That narrow sliver of the population, the top 10th of 1%, now own more than the bottom 80% of Americans. One of our witnesses today, Dr. Zuckman, has done important work tracking these trends going back a century. His most recent work looks at the role played by our tax system. It is widely believed that our tax system is progressive, that the rich pay a larger percentage of their income in taxes. However, Dr. Zuckman's recent work reveals that in 2018, the wealthiest 400 Americans paid a lower total tax rate than any other income group. Sadly, this is not an accident. It is deliberate public policy. In 2017, the Republican Congress and President Trump slashed taxes on the rich, borrowing $1.9 trillion to do it. Inequality in America was already sky high. The Republican tax cut made it far worse. Skyrocketing inequality undermines our middle-class society in which anyone who works hard has a chance to succeed. It means that for millions of Americans, the American dream may be a myth. Our second witness, economist Heather Boucher, argues that high levels of inequality undermine economic growth because strong growth depends in part on a strong middle class. Consumer spending accounts for 70% of the U.S. economy, but as a larger and larger share of income and wealth go to those at the top, there is less left over for everyone else. As a result, most Americans have less money in their pockets, less to spend on what businesses sell. Therefore, when the bottom 50%, those who consume a much larger share of income compared to those at the top, see no income growth for 40 years, that is a major problem. Extreme inequality also undermines our communities. The chairman and I agree that healthy communities with strong social capital are critical to a high quality of life. But extreme inequality undermines that. When wealth is highly concentrated and in a society where education is critical to success, families have extremely high incentives to live in towns with other wealthy families so they can put their children in the best school systems. So Americans increasingly become segregated by wealth, and their quality of life becomes dependent on their zip code. Extreme inequality also undermines our democratic institutions. It enables the powerful to rig the rules to make themselves even more powerful. We see the erosion of antitrust laws, the breakdown of protections for small investors, the rejection of overtime protection for workers. We pay a very high price for extreme inequality. How bad is inequality in the United States? Economists disagree about the severity of the problem, but while they disagree about how much inequality has worsened in recent decades, there is little disagreement. Things are getting worse. One way that we measure the strength of our economy is by quarterly measures of gross domestic product. It's a good aggregate number. It tells us how fast the whole economic pie is growing. But the slices of the pie that go to the rich, middle class, and poor are extremely unequal. Unfortunately, we currently don't measure how economic growth is shared. For this reason, I have introduced the Measuring Real Income Growth Act, and I'm pleased that Senator Heinrich is introducing a companion bill in the Senate. The bill would require the Bureau of Economic Analysis to report GDP growth by income and the top 1% alongside the top line number. It will help us understand not just how fast the economy is growing, but who is benefiting from the growth. Academic economists such as Dr. Zuckman have produced estimates similar to those we are asking from BEA, but we need the government to do this in a regular and timely manner. Inequality is one of the most pressing issues of our day. It is tearing our society apart and undermining much of what we stand for. In order to understand inequality, we must have better ways to measure it, ways that are accepted by those on both sides of the aisle. With that information in hand, we can begin to restore our economy to the land of opportunity. I would now like to call on Chairman Mr. Lee for his opening statement, and then we'll go to other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Vice Chair Maloney, for holding this hearing. This is an interesting topic, and I look forward to our conversation this afternoon. Inequality has been a hinge of American politics, and indeed something of a hinge in all democracies for as long as democracies have existed. And with some good reason. The concentration of economic power can be as dangerous as the concentration of political power. Unfortunately, the debate about inequality, like far too many debates these days, can easily be swept up into a partisan exercise of talking past each other. We could spend our entire time, or we could spend entire days for that matter, haggling over whether inequality is best understood as something that involves unequal opportunity or instead involves unequal outcomes. Or indeed, if the latter, we could argue for hours about whether and how much it is even a problem, given that almost every facet of modern life, from air conditioning to airplanes, can be counted among the blessings of intentionally unequal benefits, the unequal benefits of free enterprise. Inequality is such a large concept that it's very difficult to tackle in a single hearing. That's why I commend Vice Chair Maloney for organizing today's hearing on measuring inequality, and for inviting such an excellent panel of witnesses to talk to us, people with a lot of expertise and insight. The subject of data measurement techniques is at once narrow enough to keep our discussion focused and hopefully technical enough that even Congress can set aside political temptations and simply drill down on some very important questions. For instance, how exactly should we define income for purposes of measuring inequality between rich, poor, and middle class? How should we count government transfers, like the Earned Income Tax Credit for lower income workers? As the scholarship on inequality measurement has progressed, which technical details have survived peer review scrutiny and which remain to be worked out before we can reach some type of academic consensus? These are not the questions that will necessarily lead cable news political talk shows. That's why they're exactly the kinds of questions the Joint Economic Committee should be taking up. Even the best policies involve trade-offs. Our economy is growing. And today, our economy happens to employ more people than it ever has before. But it has, in fact, been a long slog out of the Great Recession, much longer for some, regrettably, than for others. If the data really can afford us a clearer view of how the costs and benefits of economic growth are being experienced as we move up and down the economic scales, as we move up and down the income spectrum, that is the type of analysis we should all insist on getting and insist on making sure that we get it right. So thank you again, Madam Vice Chair, and to the witnesses that we're going to hear from today. I look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to introduce our witnesses, and each will have 5 minutes, and then we'll go to questions. Dr. Gabriel Zuckman is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of California, Berkeley. His research focuses on distribution and taxation of global wealth. Professor Zuckman is the author of The Hidden Wealth of Nations, which found that 8% of the world's wealth is held in tax havens. He is co-author of The Just Release, The Triumph of Injustice, How the Rich Dodge Taxes and How to Make Them Pay. Mr. Zuckman received his PhD from the Paris School of Economics, and Dr. Boucher is the president and CEO and co-founder of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Her research focuses on the intersection between economic inequality, growth, and public policy. Dr. Boucher is author of the just-released Unbound, How Economic Inequality Constricts Our Economy and What We Can Do About It. Previously, she worked as an economist in several organizations, including the Center for American Progress, the Economic Policy Institute, and the Joint Economic Committee. She received her PhD in economics from the New School for Social Research, and Dr. Holtz Aiken is president of the American Action Forum, which he founded in 2009. Previously, he has served as director of the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office and as chief economist at the Council of Economic Advisors. Dr. Aiken spent more than a decade at Syracuse University, where he was trustee professor of economics at the Maxwell School. He has a PhD in economics from Princeton University. And Dr. Eric Zwick is associate professor of finance in the Booth School of Business at the University of Chicago. His research focuses on the impacts of public policy on corporate behavior, with a particular focus on the challenges facing small and medium-sized firms. He has a PhD in business economics from Harvard University. Thank you all for coming on this really important subject. And Dr. Zuckman, you're recognized first, and we'll go right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman Lee and Vice Chair Maloney, for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be here. My name is Gabriel Zuckman, and I'm an associate professor of economics at the University of California, Berkeley. My work seeks to advance the measurement of inequality. With my colleagues, Facundo Alvaredo, Lucas Chancel, Thomas Piketty, and Emmanuel Saez, I am one of the co-directors of the World Inequality Database, an extensive database on the long-run evolution of income and wealth inequality. One of our goals is to contribute to the creation of comprehensive, standardized, and internationally comparable inequality statistics that capture all forms of income contributing to GDP. So concretely, when GDP grows 3%, let's say, in a given year, we want to be able to know how income is growing for each social group in a way that's consistent with the official rate of GDP growth. We call these statistics distributional national accounts. To understand the ultimate goal and value of this project, the following analogy is helpful. According to the official national accounts of the United States, real GDP grew 2.9% in 2018. This number involves some uncertainty. The measurement of GDP, after all, relies on many assumptions. There are projections based on preliminary reports that can only be confirmed months or years down the road. There are imputations, for example, of the rents that homeowners pay to themselves. There are assumptions about how much income is underreported by taxpayers to the IRS. But despite these uncertainties, most people trust official estimates of GDP. These estimates are based on methods that have been improved over several decades. They are based on internationally agreed and constantly refined concepts and methods. They are constructed by hundreds of highly qualified government statisticians. My hope is that one day we'll reach the point where statistics of inequality are constructed and regarded like GDP statistics. With my colleagues, we try to contribute to this evolution. We have created prototype distributional national accounts, that is, statistics that distribute the national account aggregates such as national income, household wealth, tax revenue, and government spending across the population. These prototype distributional national accounts are based on a conceptual framework that we developed over several years. They are based on harmonized guidelines, concepts, and estimation techniques that we have applied and are applying to many countries. They are constantly updated when new data becomes available and refined estimation techniques are designed. All the data series are made available in a user-friendly manner on the World Inequality Database WID.world. All programs, computer code, and technical appendices are publicly available. All our results can be replicated using publicly available data. Users are free to change our methodology, and we constantly refine our methods as we receive new feedback and new knowledge emerges. These prototype distributional national accounts show a large rise in income inequality. In 1980, the top 1% earned 10% of total pre-tax income. Today, it earns about 20% of total pre-tax income. Although we've put a lot of effort in building this prototype, it remains a prototype. The methods underpinning our distributional national accounts are still in their infancy. Much more work needs to be done. Our hope is that these prototype will eventually be taken over by government, improved, and published as part of the official toolkit of government statistics. This is what happened for the national accounts in the first place. It may take years, even decades, before this happens. But in the meantime, it is perfectly normal to have methodological discussions, debates, and disagreements. This does not mean that we cannot know what is happening to inequality today. A wide array of evidence shows high and rising inequality. Each of these sources have limitations. All economic statistics are constructions whose limitations must be understood. But by working together, we can arrive at the best possible estimates and reach the stage where the publication of inequality statistics will be just like the publication of GDP. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Vice Chair Maloney and Chairman Lee, for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor to be here. My name is Heather Boucher, and I'm President and CEO of the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. We seek to advance evidence-backed ideas and policies in pursuit of growth that is strong, stable, and broadly shared. One of the most important things we can do to fight inequality in the United States right now is to start keeping track of it. Government statistics drive economic policymaking in Congress, the Federal Reserve, and the executive agencies. Inequality should be added to this pantheon, and the right way to incorporate inequality is to add measures of growth within income quantiles to the national income and product accounts. This extension to our existing national income accounts updates them to better reflect the realities of the 21st century economy. Vice Chair Maloney has introduced a bill that would do just that, and I want to thank her for her attention to this important issue. The bill is called the Measuring Real Income Growth Act, and it will tell us what growth looks like for low, middle, and high-income Americans. The one-number approach to growth we use now is no longer sufficient. In the 1960s and 70s, growth in our economy was broad-based. When the economy grew, most families saw their incomes rise in tandem. But that pattern fell apart starting sometime around 1980. Over the past 40 years, most growth has gone to a small group of people, those at the top of the income distribution. When growth is so unequally distributed, aggregate measures are misleading. Distributional measures of growth answer an increasingly important question: who prospers when the economy grows? Measuring growth for Americans up and down the income ladder will have profound impacts on economic discourse and on policymaking. First, it will connect the idea of aggregate economic data with the real life circumstances of families in the economy. When a worker sees politicians touting strong growth but looks around and sees no evidence of that in their community, they are right to feel that they are being left behind. Second, distributional accounts will focus our attention on the economic well-being of families, which is, after all, what growth is supposed to deliver. Third, distributional measures of growth will guide policymakers in designing policies that both raise output and do it in a way that everyone gains. Finally, these metrics will allow citizens to hold their elected representatives accountable to delivering an economy that works for all. Now is the time for the Bureau of Economic Analysis to incorporate distributional measures into our regularly released national accounts. The statistical science around this topic is increasingly mature. In addition to work by academics, the OECD has created an expert group to study a new standard for distributional measures of income. Some member countries have already adopted versions of these measures in their official statistics. Here in the United States, the Federal Reserve has started reporting a distributional breakdown of the financial accounts. Critically, these measurements fill in a significant gap in our understanding of the U.S. economy. For decades, our economic policy has been driven by the presumption that we must increase growth at all costs. Proponents of this view argue that, quote, growing the pie is the most important metric of success. This presumption is wrong. There's a large and growing body of empirical research that shows that we cannot create strong or broadly shared economic gains through a policy agenda that allows those at the top to reap the bulk of the gains. First, research shows that inequality obstructs the development of human capital. Children from low-income families have worse health outcomes and fewer educational opportunities, which has long-run effects on productivity and output. Second, research shows that inequality is subverting the proper function of the institutions that manage the market. A small number of citizens with immense wealth exercise outsized influence on policy, entrenching their wealth by lowering taxes and weakening protections on labor. Third, inequality distorts both consumption and investment. Research confirms the intuition that the rich save more of their income. Rising income inequality puts more money in the hands of the rich and depresses overall economic demand, while simultaneously encouraging a greater reliance on credit rather than productive investment. Because rising inequality obstructs, subverts, and distorts our economy, we cannot be indifferent to how growth is distributed. The new measurements proposed by Vice Chair Maloney will help us chart a path to stable, broad-based growth that benefits all Americans. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Vice Chair Maloney, Chairman Lee, members of the committee, thank you for the privilege of being here today to discuss this important research area and the policy implications of it. We are all by now quite familiar with the characterization of income inequality and its evolution over the past 4 decades, a characterization that includes the share going to the top 1% rising from roughly 10 to 20%, and incomes for those in the bottom half of the distribution remaining essentially flat. So as someone who is a consumer of this research literature as much as anyone, it's disconcerting to read recent research by Jerry Otten and David Splinter that reexamines these patterns and finds, in fact, at the top, the rise was quite modest, perhaps 2%, and that in the bottom 50%, the income increased by about 1/3 over that period. And that's a very different picture of the level and evolution of inequality in the United States. It's clear there is no consensus. And if you dig into this, it turns out that the results that you get are incredibly sensitive to the kinds of things that neither you nor I would know how to make a decision on. What is going to be the basic unit of observation? Are we going to look at households, or are we going to look at tax filing units? What is going to be the definition of income? What will be in it? Will we try to scale to get all national income or not? How do we impute the things that we don't actually directly observe? And it's quite striking how sensitive the results are to different choices of the measure of inflation over that time period. It makes a big difference for the results. And so I think it's fair to say at this point there is no real consensus about the level or evolution of income inequality, and that this is an ongoing and active area of research that hopefully some agreement will be reached by the various researchers. It does, for me at least, raise the question of how we want to think about the policy implications of the research. If we really don't know where we are, it's hard to figure out exactly what the policy design would be. And on top of that, it's not obvious what the goal is. What is the right level of inequality? And how would you actually identify it and institute policies to get to it? Surely we're not trying to get to zero, where everyone gets exactly the same thing, so that we have to stop somewhere in between. And I have yet to see anyone articulate a stopping point in a way for us to think about the objectives of this policy. And so if you don't know where you're starting and you don't know where you're going, it's not much of a situation where you'd want to take aggressive policy action. The final thing I'd emphasize that comes out quite clearly in this is, while there's casual talk about the top 1% or the middle income or the lower income as if they were monolithic entities, there's a huge amount of movement in and out of those. In research that Jerry Otten did, you find that something between 37 and 47% of those people in the 1% are gone a year later. So being a 1%er might be a one-time lifetime event. You sell a business, you're a 1%er, you weren't before, you never will be again. And how we think about policies toward any part of that income distribution, we should think hard about whether people are going to be there for any sustained period of time. It makes a difference in the policy design. So When I look at this literature and I recognize the sort of deep caring that's always been true in the United States about inequality, it leads me to the modest suggestion that perhaps the right thing to do until the research is settled is to focus on the piece of inequality about which we all agree, the lower tail, those people who are poor in America, have been poor, may remain poor. There, I think, is consensus that we ought to do something about that wherever possible and spend a little less time fighting about policies toward the rich and spend a lot more time thinking about strategies to reduce the level of poverty in the United States on a permanent basis. Thank you, and look forward to your questions.
Vice Chair Maloney, thanks to you, Chairman Lee, and members of the committee for the opportunity to appear today to discuss my research and lessons for measuring economic inequality. My name is Eric Zwick. I'm an associate professor of finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. I make 3 points in my testimony that I'll summarize here. First, inequality is high and has risen. A meaningful scientific consensus supports this basic point. However, the academic community is still debating the size of this increase and learning about the composition of high-end inequality. For example, relative to what we previously thought, households at the top of the income distribution derive more of their income from work and from entrepreneurship and less from investment income like dividends and interest. Most top earners are private business owners, a group that includes lawyers, doctors, consultants, owners of mid-sized businesses such as auto dealers and wholesale distributors. In both number and aggregate income, these groups far surpass that of high-tech billionaires and public company CEOs who have been the focus of much inequality commentary. In an early stage paper, I have found that wealth concentration has risen, but risen less, and depends more on private business ownership than previously thought. I do want to stress that our results do not imply that wealth concentration is low or irrelevant from a policymaker's perspective. Second, my second point is that measuring broad inequality does require assumptions based on evolving data collection and methods. Therefore, conclusions from the research frontier are somewhat uncertain. The state of the art on implementing distributional national accounts, or DINAs, which would provide statistics like GDP but broken out by income groups, remains a work in progress. The core issue is that DINA methods require many assumptions. The ultimate conclusions are sensitive to which assumptions we make. When data are missing on who gets what type of income, researchers make certain assumptions to fill in the gaps. For example, in the leading prototype of DINAs for the United States, there's a strong link between Sayez and Zuckman's and Dr. Zuckman's wealth estimates, Piketty, Sayez, and Zuckman's DINA estimates, and Sayez and Zuckman's recent work on tax progressivity. If we change the assumptions for estimated wealth inequality, that will change distributional income estimates. And changing distributional income estimates will change estimates of average tax rates at the top and bottom. Now, my view, these assumptions are in most cases well justified, but they necessarily rely on incomplete data and convenient simplification. Thus, alternative assumptions can be equally, and in some cases better, justified, with significant implications for what stories we tell about how inequality has evolved and what lessons we draw for tax policy. It's also important to recall that what we observe in tax data is influenced by reporting responses to changing tax rules over time. So the same high-level statistics might be consistent with very different underlying stories of what's going on. This uncertainty is where the scholarship plays its role. So my third point is that I recommend several clear next steps for collecting new data to help implement DINAs and improve inequality measures. First, task the Bureau of Economic Analysis with developing a process to produce DINA estimates, to prepare a public technical report, and open up findings and methodological details to expert feedback. A recent effort by economists at the Federal Reserve to distribute the U.S. financial accounts demonstrates the value of such a process. Second, new tax laws that require partnerships and C corporations to trace and report their ultimate owners could help improve our DINA estimates. Third, expanding the IRS's random audit program could improve our understanding of underreported income and help improve our DINA estimates. And last, improving data collection on retirement account balances and the portfolio composition could improve our DINA estimates because that data is currently not used. The academic literature remains somewhat divided on the technical specifics of distributional accounts, but these divisions largely reflect an evolving state of current knowledge that is changing as new data becomes available. This is not unusual in academic research. The glass is half full. I strongly believe that we will reconcile these differences and continue to build toward a consensus method over time. Some final remarks. To advance our learning, I think this committee could facilitate a substantive conversation about several outstanding questions. For example, what role have population aging, changes in the pension system played in measuring these trends? Second, how important is multi-generational wealth versus self-made wealth? Third, what are the consequences of inequality for disparities in opportunity, especially for children? Let me also say that I greatly admire Dr. Zuckman's work and that of his colleagues, Thomas Piketty and Emmanuel Saez, despite our occasional friendly disagreements over accounting methods. I've learned a lot from them, and my work would not have been possible without theirs. And last, I want to reiterate my reading of the evidence is not that inequality in America is low or that it has not increased at all. Rather, my reading is that the increase has been more modest. The nature of the increase skews away from the passive capital highlighted in Piketty's book and toward human capital, labor, and entrepreneurial activity. Thank you for your time. Look forward to questions.
Thank you. I'm calling first on Senator Heinrich. He's got a conflict. He's got a challenge with his time.
I'll keep this short in respect of all my colleagues' time. Dr. Boucher, I just wanted to ask how important it would be to make sure that as we implement these new statistics, that they actually be produced concurrently with when other statistics are produced. So, for example, most economic statistics come out quarterly. If we want to understand the relationships, how important is it to be on sort of the same calendar as everything else that we rely on when we try to manage the economy?
Thank you, Senator. It's a really important question. Currently we release data from the National Income Product accounts on GDP, gross domestic product, quarterly. And I think it would be very important that as the BEA puts together this methodology, that the goal be for the distributional data to be released alongside the GDP. It is through doing that we will learn how growth is distributed. I think actually what's happened at the Federal Reserve with their distributional accounts on the financial side shows that is possible. That is what they have done. They've taken the nation's financial accounts and they've appended them to survey data and are able to make extrapolations that allow that data to be released on a quarterly basis, which has just started this fall. So I think that shows a good roadmap for how BEA could do it. And I think it is not just possible, but it is imperative for the policy debate that as we get that quarterly GDP, we understand who in America is benefiting, where it is happening. Ideally, I would like to be able to see that across place. And ideally across race and to some extent gender, but probably that's a little bit more complicated. But I think that having people understand who growth is benefiting in that timely way is probably one of the most imperative new statistics that we need from federal agencies.
Chairman Lee is recognized.
Thank you very much, Madam Vice Chair, and thanks to all of you for being here. Dr. Zwick, we're going to start with you, if that's all right. You've written that the data for different types of income are often sensitive to the type of tax regime that's at issue. Do I understand that correctly? And if a particular type of income receives favorable tax treatment, some income may be relabeled to take advantage of that treatment. In other words, you squish one end of the balloon, air is going to go somewhere else in that balloon. Does this suggest that we should be careful interpreting estimates of income inequality or taxes paid in the year immediately following a major tax reform package? For example, a year like 1987 or like 2018. And what's the most recent year for which you feel that we have sufficiently high quality and reliable data?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. I think, the basic point is that if there's a different tax rate for types of income, I think we see this especially in entrepreneurial situations where you have the ability to pay yourself either as labor or capital, dependent and subject to the tax rules, of course. We've seen responses to tax regimes that include this relabeling response. And so the income that's reported as capital, for example, might actually reflect labor income sort of under the hood if you actually thought about the economic nature. And we use a bunch of methods to try and estimate the extent to which capital income as reported actually reflects labor, using, say, when an owner prematurely dies of a small business or an owner prematurely retires, thinking about how the business reacts to that If it were just passive capital, the business would continue operating, but if it were more a mix of capital and labor, the business would change. So those kinds of issues show up, they're always present, and to the extent that there are different tax rates on different kinds of income, those issues can be larger. So as we move, capital tax rates relative to labor tax rates, those issues can be larger. So, over time, we've had different tax changes, and come right around these reforms, the specific behavioral labeling response is uncertain.
Do we have a complete and reliable data set yet for 2018, the first year following the passage of the last?
I don't think so.
Dr. Zuckman, in your New York Times op-ed, you have consumption taxes at 12.3% of income for the lowest income group. And yet, to my knowledge, no state has sales taxes higher than around 9%. And many states, of course, have carve-outs designed to make the sales tax less regressive by carving out things like unprepared food. Your methods state that this is because they pay sales tax on goods purchased with transfer income. Is that correct? Am I stating that correctly? In other words, that the difference between the fact that no state has sales taxes higher than 9% and your figure of 12.3% is made up for as a result of the fact that you figure that some of these transfer programs involve people paying for things using money that they get through one of the programs. Is that right?
So what we try to do in this book is very much what we try to do in this overall project of distributional national accounts, which is allocate the aggregate amount of tax revenue collected by the U.S., just like we want to allocate total GDP. And total consumption taxes are actually broader than sales taxes, also include excise taxes or other indirect taxes. So that's the main explanation for the numbers that you mentioned. And what I want to say is that—
But the total excise taxes aren't made up for in that difference between 9% and 12.3%, are they?
Yes, no.
You maintain that they are.
State sales taxes are only a fraction of total consumption taxes in the U.S. You have federal excise taxes, you have tariffs, you have other indirect taxes such as business licenses. So what I want to say is, ultimately, I think it would be helpful also for the government to publish statistics of effective tax rates by income group that are comprehensive, that take into account 100% of the official amount of tax revenue collected by the U.S. We try to provide a prototype of this. We are the first ones to distribute 100% of the total amount of tax revenue, 28% of national income. This is work in progress. These are methods that can be improved and that hopefully will be improved and taken over by government statisticians in the future.
But do I have this right, though, that if some government transfer program expanded, the program itself expanded, and poor people who benefited under that program, who received money under that program, were able to buy more things as a result of that expansion, that would show up in your estimates as higher tax rates for poor people because they would pay more sales tax, but they would not be credited with having more income. Am I understanding that correctly?
This is an interesting methodological question, Mr. Chairman, and we took that into account by restricting the population to people who earn more than half the federal minimum wage in income. So typically, these are people who might receive some transfer income, but that's not playing a big role in these specific statistics. So we've thought hard about these questions.
But the answer is yes, right? The answer is yes, isn't it?
The answer is yes, but quantitatively, this is very minor.
Understood.
Qualitatively, you are correct.
My time's expired. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. I'd like to ask each of the witnesses, what level of confidence do you have in evidence that inequality is rising? We are all here today because shared prosperity matters to American people. The GDP is the commonly used indicator to measure the growth of the economy, but it doesn't tell us how the growth is shared across the economy. We often have to wait years for researchers to get to the data and report on key trends. So I'd like to ask each of you, do you agree that having more detailed data produced by the federal government and shared on a regular basis on who is benefiting from economic growth would allow us to better evaluate the impact of policies? And start with you, Dr. Suckman, and let's just have everyone's thought on it. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your question. As our discussion shows, there is a great demand in society for statistics that decompose GDP, national income, other macroeconomic aggregates by income groups. And there would be a huge value in publishing those statistics. The way that I see this process unfolding is very much like what happened with the national accounts in the first place. You know, the national accounts were developed by economists such as Simon Kuznets in the 1930s in the US, and then they were taken over by official government statisticians and government agencies, and ever since they are refined and improved year after year. And I think that's the path forward, and we hope to contribute to that process. That's how to build trust in these all-important statistics.
Yeah, thank you. I think I think it is very important that we have more detailed data on how growth is being distributed. One of the things that we see when we look at the way that policy is discussed, the way that the economy is talked about, we get data regularly on the aggregate economic output through GDP and other measures. But what we only get data irregularly, only once a year, on income inequality. And I think it's very important that we put those two conversations together because we used to be a country in the 60s and 70s where when GDP grew, most Americans saw their incomes grow at the same rate. Since 1980, it is only people in the top 10% of the income distribution that see their incomes grow at least as the average of GDP, if not above. So most people are not experiencing that average growth, yet we're going out, the federal government is going out every quarter and saying the economy grew by 3.3% or the economy grew by 2% when the vast majority of families are experiencing growth in their income, which is far below that. I think we have a responsibility to connect those dots, and we have the tools and the prototype and the skills within inside the Bureau of Economic Analysis to make this real.
I certainly think if you want to have solid policies, you ought to measure better. I don't think that should be an objectionable goal. We do get annual reports on inequality and on income growth, and they point out quite vividly sometimes the difference between the top line and what's going on. So in 2016, families who worked full-time for the full year saw exactly zero increase in their real incomes. That's census data. Nevertheless, we didn't have zero macroeconomic growth. And so we don't reconcile those in a deep way statistically. So I think we should not object to the fact that we need to understand this better, measure it better. And the thing that I would just repeat from my opening remarks is it's important not to pretend that people are somehow stuck in a particular place. They're moving around a lot, and measuring that mobility would be comparably important in my view.
Yeah, I think I generally, I'm an empirical researcher, so I'm always going to be supportive of more high-quality data. So I think this is a case where not only the empirical researchers, but I think a much broader community would really value this product. I think what we know about whether inequality is rising is, we learn with a considerable lag currently. So I could say that the scientific consensus is that it has risen, but what's going on right now is much harder to say.
Representative Swikert, to be followed by Representative Byer.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Vice Chairman. Okay, this is like kid in a candy store for some of us, which is why my staff, I think, is, has given up caffeine because I make them nervous. Three of you, I've actually read a number of your things. Can I throw out first a couple concepts? I'm going to read something, and then let's do a couple quick questions. I will argue in many ways the fixation particularly on some of the tax reporting data from both our country and around the world, and I have a fixation on income inequality, but I believe you're missing a whole bunch of the way you would properly model it. Everything from if you actually do proper overlays of where we are demographically, some of the unusual things we've seen in the data of millennial males underperforming in labor force participation, the fixation on what wealthy have compared to the thing I wish, and Doctor, I know you've done some of this, velocity. What is my movement from someone falling in, and can I use the language quartiles? Just because when I was in school, that's what we called it, and no one else here in the panel did that. So I don't want to be, I'm so fearful of being offensive to anyone, but when we would talk about the 2, 3 lower quartiles, we had a fixation of what was healthy in an economy was our brothers and sisters moving up and out of some of those lower quartiles. And a fixation of my distribution difference is actually, in many ways, dishonest. Because if my vast portion of my population, my brothers and sisters who didn't graduate high school, and all of a sudden I see amazing movement, particularly in the last year, 2 years. So look, I'm looking at some data right here. Real medium earnings for female households with no spouse present jumped 7.6% last year. We should be giddy about those sorts of numbers, but the data you provide us, the data better modeling should be talking to us as policymakers of how do we do more of that? I mean, if I came to you and said a 7.6 movement in a time of almost no inflation in a quartile that had a brutal previous decade, we should be joyful and we should be figuring out how to do more of it. And my fear is the partisan rage that often hears is we're trying to make arguments on income distribution instead of there are things that are stunning numbers, they're preliminary. And we have a couple authors out there in your field that are saying the last year may be the very first year in modern times where income inequality either was flat or shrunk because our lower quartiles, particularly the lower 3, had such income movement. It's not done yet. Maybe I'm being pathologically hopeful. And Dr. Holtz, I consider you a friend because you tolerate some of my eccentricities.
And I consider you pathologically hopeful.
Yeah, that too. Well, look, I'm 57 with a 4-year-old. That should have been funnier for the room. What do we do to understand of the uniqueness of right now where all my economic studies, because I've been in joint economics since I got here, from just a couple of years ago said the types of numbers I've seen in the last year were impossible. Moving back well over 63% labor force participation was impossible. How do I understand, knowing the data, knowing what's is great, how do I understand what's worked?
Measure it. I mean, honestly, for those of us who care about the evolution of the economy, we're always really reading economic history. At best, we're getting data which are last month's. Usually they're older than that. We're guessing about what's going on right now. We never really know. And for me to give you any kind of a scientific answer to what is different in 2018-19 in terms of labor market performance, we're going to have to measure better. We have lots of suspicions about it, but we don't know for sure, and that's the reality.
Do you all consider it statistically very significant that in a single year, a half-point drop in the poverty rate in a single year?
Yes.
I mean, so A, from the political world, we should be joyful, but B, how do we find out data-wise what was working, what drove that? Because I know in our modern politics, we fixate on the wealthy and say, look what they have, you don't have. But if we're going to be actually great for our society, we should be fixating what our brothers and sisters in those lower quartiles have and how we get them to have more. And
I think including, the kind of characteristics like you described, like more fixed characteristics and seeing what happens to those people from year to year. The data are available but in the distributional accounts.
well, in the last kind, because we also have the problem in the joint economic where we're saying, here's census data, here's BLS data, as we know, tax data has stunning amounts of noise in it. And then trying to normalize that and then trying to put over what's happening in our state and local and try to normalize each jurisdiction and their effects, it would be fascinating, and you will spend a lifetime just doing adjustments. And you know, when you do that many adjustments, your final outcome, the variance, is unacceptable. So with that, I yield back, Madam Chairman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you all very much for coming and being part of this. First time we've ever had a panel with two people whose names begin with Z, which is really important.
Amen.
Yeah. Both doctors. Yeah, exactly, all doctors. You know, when the Tax Cut and Jobs Act of 2017 was signed, I feared it would result in a significant redistribution of wealth towards the richest among us. But I was really struck by Dr. Zuckman's figure, published a lot last week, that after the law in effect, the 400 richest households now shoulder a lower overall tax burden, 23%, than the entire bottom 50%, which is 24%. It's the first time in 100 years this has been true. So this is very relevant that you're here. Dr. Zwick, I struggled through all 800 pages of Thomas Piketty's book. And the main takeaway I had from it was that the return on capital was much greater than the return on labor. And yet you talk about that in your research, you found the top inequality is more human capital intensive. And it seems like you basically, the cut is that you look at pass-through income as more on the wealth side rather than the income side, whereas as a car dealer, whom you refer to, and here I know there's often very much on the labor side. Can you talk about your differences with Piketty on his central conclusion?
Yeah, sure, and I'll be very brief, but thanks so much for the question, Congressman. The difference is basically about the difference between using aggregate statistics, the aggregate flows you can compute in the interest rate you can compare it to these aggregate returns on labor. Might tell one story, and what we do is use sort of micro data. So it's kind of from the bottom up trying to ask, of the top 1%, what share of them are in different industries? How big are their firms? How many firms do they own? Basic descriptive statistics that you don't need a PhD to understand. And what we find is that, and it was surprising to us when we looked underneath this, so it was not what we were expecting. There's just a ton of doctors, there's a ton of dentists, there's auto dealers, there's like a sort of a much broader, richer view of the economy than what you see if you read the newspaper. You know, all the journalists live in New York, there's a lot of finance in the newspaper, but it's a much broader economy, and that includes at the very top of the income distribution.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Dr. Zuckman, one of the criticisms people are throwing back about your research, which I very much appreciate, the research, not the criticism, is that they leave out all the transfer payments. You know, their earned income tax credit and food stamps, and how do you, is that valid? And would the income inequality not be nearly as great if you included the things that are not part of that AGI?
Thank you very much, Congressman, for this very important question. So we do look at all taxes and also all government spending. In our prototype distributional national accounts, we care about both because we want to study what's the overall redistributive effect of government intervention in the economy. So we have two sets of statistics. We have statistics on income distribution before taxes and transfers, and we have statistics on income distribution when you measure income after taxes and transfers. And in both cases, adding up to 100% of national income or 100% of GDP. And when you do that, what you see is that there is less inequality after taxes and transfers. So, you know, the overall tax and transfer system is redistributive, and that's very important. But we also find that the rise in inequality is almost the same after taxes and transfers as compared to before taxes and transfers. In both cases, you've had a big increase in income concentration.
Okay, thank you very much. Dr. Boucher, I have 3 millennial daughters, and they are very much affected by this income inequality, at least until they inherit the car dealers' money. From a policy standpoint, how do we address the millennials?
Oh, what a great question. You know, I mean, so what we're here to talk about today is how we measure economic progress. We know that the younger generations from a lot of different data sets are struggling in this economy. There are a lot of different ways that the concentration of wealth and income is making it harder for them to get their footing, to move their way up if they're not lucky enough to have a parent that's bequeathing them a small business or the like. So I think starting by figuring out how we can increase opportunity, remove the obstructions to opportunity, especially for kids, those millennials that are at the lower end of the income distribution. Personally, some of my favorites include things like thinking about how we're going to deal with education, especially early childhood education, how we're going to ensure that there are good jobs for them. Will they have the right to join a union? Will they have the right to have a job that has access to benefits like health care or paid family medical leave? Those are some of the places I would focus, but those really hinge on making sure that we address the concentration of wealth, and particularly market concentration. Many of those millennials are looking at labor markets that what economists were so great with our words, but are monopsony labor markets, meaning that they don't have a lot of options where to work. And I think thinking about that side of the economy, we haven't done enough of. So I would start by focusing there.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. Representative Joyce Beatty.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you to all of our scholarly witnesses here. Let me start by saying I am overwhelmed. I am just simply overwhelmed. And here's where I want to go with this. This is like the new thing. And for me coming to Congress with when President Barack Obama was in office, he made statements that he observed that inequality was the defining issue of our time. Well, that has continued. Whether I'm talking about the Congressional Black Caucus forums, when we do our scholarly work, it's the same titles that we have here. It's wealth creation, it's inequality, it's the gap, it's how we bring it through. Now, I'm not going to say that I have read, but I have muddled through all of your scholarly work here. And I'm having a hard time separating inequality and poverty because I think they have an effect on each other directly and indirectly through their link with economic growth. But when I read this and then I get resolved from you making statements like there is no consensus in the research or the literature, bottom line, that will give us an answer. So I'm here for some answers. I've read the theories. I read again. You'll say, given these challenges to the policies, there is no scientific research that tells us. When I go home to the 3rd Congressional District, where I represent the wealthiest and the poorest, the number one thing that I get beaten up on is this topic here today, Madam Chairwoman, and they want answers. So when I think of the question I want to pose to you, and I'll start with you, the female, Ms. Boucher, Dr. Boucher. This past July, you authored an article entitled "Neither History Nor Research Supports the Supply Side of Economics." In it, you stated that the Reagan tax cuts did not pay for themselves, and they ushered in a period of broad economic inequality. I'm with you. A substantially similar phenomenon occurred with the Bush tax cuts. Well, we already know that the Republican tax cuts passed in Congress will not pay for themselves. I think mostly everyone agrees that it was a myth, but how do you think this will affect the income equality? Is the tax code the primary driver of this income equality or what? Because I have to go back and tell people, they'll say, how do you fix me? We've got the census data, and I agree with my colleague over there. I remember the quartiles and how growth. But what is there a real bottom line answer that I go back when people say, you serve on this powerful committee, what did the experts tell you of how we resolve this?
Well, a couple of answers. First, I think that the people in your community, I would bet, would be really gratified to know that what their experience is in the economy was reflected in how we talked about economic progress. And that's the kind of data that we've been talking about that we want the Bureau of Economic Analysis to do. So no longer would we just say the economy grew at 3.3%, but we would be able to say in the average it grew by 3.3%, but for most people in the bottom quartile, growth was only 1% or growth was 5%, whatever that number is.
How do we get to increase this growth?
Okay, well, and that's, so yes, so the first thing though is I think giving people the power of the data, really important. But then
I don't think the poor people.
You
Poor
don't think
people
it's
don't.
on-
This is inside baseball. No offense to you. This is inside baseball. When you go out, it's not people like us that's asking the question. You go into a room with 1,000 people, and what they're saying to me, how do we? They are the factors on the other end of that. So this works for us because this is intellectual dialogue. But are there any answers that I go, do we need higher paid jobs? We've got disparities and discrimination. We've got women who don't make the same amount as their male counterparts. We got all, where is all of that in this for resolve? And anyone can answer that. One of the guys, jump in, somebody, because I only have 30 seconds.
As I said in the outset, I think it's appropriate, given all the uncertainty about what's going on at the upper end of the distribution, to focus on the bottom end, focus on poor people.
Okay.
And we know that there are things that really need to be done there. Education is a big problem, including early childhood education, where the evidence is there are very high returns.
Okay.
So, start with getting Americans prepared to enter the labor force and compete effectively. Do that, and the rest of their future will be brighter. And, there's a big difference between inequality rising because people got poorer and inequality rising because everyone stayed the same and the rich got richer. Let's worry about when people are poor. That should be a focus.
Okay, thank you, and my time is up, but thank you very much.
And Denny Heck, Representative Heck.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for holding a hearing on such an incredibly important subject. In addition to the other factors that my colleague mentioned, we've also got the Federal Reserve. And it's pretty, Heather knows exactly where I'm going on this. It's pretty clear that over the last 25 years, the Fed, in a well-intended effort to anticipate an overheating of the economy, has tapped the brakes before we reach full employment. We know this to be the case because they rarely reach their inflation target. They're almost always below it. And as a consequence, and arguably, especially, low-skilled or low-income workers are having a harder time receiving wage growth. And that's not an insignificant part of the overall suppression of wage growth over the last 30 years. So I guess my first question is have any of you studied, in particular, the impact on wage growth for as a consequence of the Fed's policy? No, not their policy, I would suggest, because they're not achieving their policy, their practice. Have any of you studied the impact on wage growth of federal policy? Dr. Boucher first, if you don't mind, sir, because she's from Washington State.
I've got the home court advantage here. Not from Olympia, though. But I think that I'm so glad you asked about the Fed, and I think it's connected with the Congresswoman's question about what we can do to help families all across the United States. The Fed has a mandate to keep employment high and inflation low. And of course, we think there's a trade-off there. What we're seeing right now is that we have very low unemployment, and yet that hasn't led to the kinds of wage increases that we would have expected. If you would have told us a decade ago, oh, you would have seen unemployment this low for this long.
Let me stop you.
Yeah.
Are you going to argue that the Phillips curve is broken? Because
I-
we
you
don't
know, I
have
was-
enough. We don't have enough time for that argument. Because the
wasn't gonna-
truth is, Dr. Boucher, we are still adding jobs into the labor market at a rate in excess, or at a number in excess of replacement. So we're clearly not at full employment yet.
Right, exactly. And so the Fed needs to keep doing its job. But here's the thing. I think what this moment shows us is that we need other policies around the Fed to ensure that people in those communities see the wage increases that they should be seeing with low unemployment. So last time that we saw unemployment this low, we had communities where more people were members of unions. So they had an institution where they could bargain for higher pay without having to threaten to quit their job, right? You had less market concentration because we were enforcing, especially in the 60s, we were enforcing antitrust differently, which gave workers more opportunities to be able to switch jobs and to raise their pay. So my point is that the Fed is incredibly important, but I'm not letting you off the hook because there are other parts of the policy that we need to, the policy environment that we need to do to make sure that we.
Heather, I've never tried to wriggle off the hook. Let's be real clear about that. But it seems to me the great unspoken part of this discussion is the Fed's not actually doing what their statutory charge is. And we don't know what it would look like over the last 25 years as they have continued to fight the last war, hyperinflation of the 70s, in order to squeeze out that incredibly destructive
But you're in a
impact on the
pickle.
economy.
You're in a pickle now, Congressman, because we have interest rates that are very low, and the Fed does have all of these new tools that they've been using,
They raised them 4 times last year.
that they did, but
And
they are
we
still.
were not at full
they are-
employment, and we're still not at full employment. Can we at least allow an experiment in realizing what their statutory mandates are?
I 100% agree with you.
Okay.
I 100%
I'm not wiggling off the hook on
I'm
the other. I want to
100%
go to
agree with you,
Dr. Holtz.
but I just want to make sure that we take into account that they can't do.
You've always made that abundantly clear, and it's gratefully received again today. Dr. Holtz-Egan, I actually have a follow-up question. Is there a better way to measure full employment?
No.
Well, that's depressing.
Yeah, it is. But here's what I would say. I agree with Heather on using lots of policies, not relying so much on the Fed. I mean, I think Europe is a testament to over-reliance on monetary policy. It's a big problem. Right now, I think the Fed is actually quite cognizant of the sort of dilemma they face in achieving their mandate.
But
And
let me stop you
I
there.
could just finish.
But no, let me stop you there, because I got 18 seconds. Former Federal Reserve chairs acknowledged this problem.
But the current
Ben did it, Janet did it.
Sure.
After they left.
Sure. I think to Chairman Powell's credit, I spent a day at the San Francisco Fed talking about the benefits and costs of running a hot economy. They are thinking hard about when it is that they say stop. They know that the benefits of continuing the expansion disproportionately benefit those who are marginally attached to the labor force, have the weakest skills, lowest education.
Let
So
me
they're
conclude,
working on
because
that.
I am over time. Because I do want to acknowledge that Chairman Powell has been more explicit in his acknowledgement of this need. And Chair Yellen was implicitly, while she was chair, more willing to acknowledge it, and explicitly since she's been. I think the trend line's good. But the fact is, under the current statutory construct, they didn't do what they were asked to do for 25 years, and they could do that again. And with that, I yield back. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, and the chair's requested a second round of questions, so we're going to do that for those who'd like to. And I'd like to ask Dr. Zuckman, you've written extensively on how the wealthy hold trillions in assets in offshore accounts. As much as 8% of the global wealth is held in offshore havens. You estimate about $200 billion in global tax revenue is lost each year. And how do these offshore havens affect estimates of inequality? And are we getting a complete picture? And also, any of the panelists, how does the U.S. experience compare to that of other advanced economies over the last 30 to 40 years? What's the trend internationally? What should we learn from other high-income countries on their efforts to track and report on inequality? Starting with Dr. Zuckman and anyone who wants to weigh in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, for this question. Yes, in my work, I have estimated that about 8% of the world's household financial wealth is held in tax havens globally. And this has implications for inequality. You know, that wealth and the income it generates typically is not captured by GDP statistics or national income statistics. So they are not even in the aggregates, and so they are not in our distributional national accounts. So it's possible and perhaps likely that we are actually underestimating the rise of income and wealth concentration for that reason. Now I'm working with colleagues, including colleagues at the IRS, to improve statistics drawing on data that has become available in recent years about Americans with offshore bank accounts and better measuring high-end tax evasion, in particular, and its implication for inequality. So that's a very important field of research. And again, that's an area where the series will be improved, will be revised, we will always have better estimates in the future.
Thank you. And does anyone want to comment on the U.S. experience compared to other advanced economies over the past 30 to 40 years?
Yeah, I'll just say a couple quick things. I think Dr. Zuckman and his colleagues have done a lot of work studying other countries. And the issues I raised, back to Chairman Lee's original question about the rules being quite important for what we measure in those series. In Europe, where we've seen relatively low increases in inequality in the reported series, there's also a lot of important closely held private business. Retained earnings are not distributed necessarily. And so I think there's additional new research looking at Scandinavia and Europe that has raised, again, this issue that like measurement, a fully distributional account would be quite helpful. So that's one point I just wanted to raise.
I think there are two interesting things that we're thinking about. One is that the rise in inequality over the past 4 decades is a global phenomenon. It's not unique to the United States. Labor markets have higher returns to skill across the globe, and it's important to think about that and think about the common factors. The second is, and this is particularly important now in the aftermath of the 2017 Act, that reform moved the taxation of business from global to territorial and changed the incentives to invest, innovate, and do it in the United States. Our developed country competitors have all done that, basically one a year for decades. And so in the data will be the implications for that reform on the way things get reported, including the more than half of business income that shows up on individual returns. And that's an important part of this debate.
And Dr. Boucher, what is going to happen? What is the risk to our economy and our society if we as a nation continue down the path we're on now with economic inequality continuing to worsen? I'll start with you and anyone else who'd like to comment.
Well, if
Not a good trend for
No, it's
anyone.
not. It's not a good trend. If we believe Thomas Piketty's book, if we allow income inequality to continue unabated, it leads to greater wealth concentration, and it will take a seemingly heroic political effort to change that. I think that the evidence is also that kind of wealth concentration is constricting of our economy more generally. It obstructs people's ability to move up. It is making it harder for people to start new businesses and to have the kind of innovation economy that we want in many sectors because of the concentration. And it's having real distortionary effects on both consumption and investment. There's new research out that talks about the ways that because of the rise in the concentration of savings, one would expect that leads to investment, but in fact it's been leading to an expansion in household credit, which, as we all learned during the Great Recession, can be destabilizing. I want to add on the international comparisons that our level of income inequality and wealth inequality here in the United States, when you look across countries, appears to be very much a choice that we've made. If other countries, according to the data we have not experienced the same kind of inequality that we have, but they've been subject to the same trends in terms of globalization and technology. And so I think really looking deep inside the kinds of institutions that we are putting in place to constrain inequality is important.
Thank you, and my time has expired. Chairman Lee.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Dr. Zuckman, I'd like to get back with you for a minute. For purposes of determining tax rates, you group people, as I understand it, by the income that they receive. And my understanding is also that you include Social Security benefits and unemployment insurance income when you create those groupings. Is that right? So someone receiving unemployment benefits would end up looking a lot poorer and thus have a higher tax rate if you didn't count those benefits as income. Is that correct?
That's correct, but we do count these benefits as income.
Got it.
To be clear.
And yet you don't count other government transfers as income when you group people. So doesn't that make them look a lot poorer and thus have higher tax rates than if you counted those benefits in that category?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That we've thought a lot about these methodological questions, which are extremely important. There are many ways to compute income, many ways, and government agencies use a variety of ways, and research papers use different definitions.
No, I get it, and I don't want to oversimplify the task. I don't want to describe it as overly simple. I just want to make sure I'm understanding correctly. You do make this classification.
What we do, the specificity of what we do is we distribute 100% of national income. which is GDP minus capital depreciation plus net income received from abroad, 100%. If you want to include transfers in your measure of income to compute tax rates, then you're allocating more than 100% of national income. And so by construction, if you give people more income than the total amount of income that there is in the economy, you're going to underestimate the tax rates of certain groups of the population. So that's the reason why we do things the way we do. But what I want to emphasize, which is very important, is again, what we're doing is a prototype to be improved, and it would be better done by government statisticians than by researchers. We hope the work we put out will be taken over, will be improved, will be refined, and will be published by government statistical agencies, including, covering the entire distribution from the bottom to the very, very top.
I totally get that, and I respect the effort. And that's one of the reasons we're having this conversation today, is because we've got to figure out effective, agreed-upon ways of measuring these things. I guess my question to you is, why is your treatment of Social Security income and unemployment insurance income different than the other categories of government transfers? How is it consistent ideologically?
We have two measures of income. One measure is pre-tax income after the operation of the pension system, so including Social Security benefits and unemployment insurance benefits. And another measure of income that we have is post-tax income, subtracting all taxes and adding all other forms of government spending. These are the two consistent measures of income that you can compute, in the sense that they distribute 100% of national income. You can construct other measures, and we do both. And you can compute tax rates as a fraction of pre-tax income or post-tax income, and we do both. You can construct other measures of income, but they won't add up to 100% of national income. So they won't make it possible to decompose economic growth by social group. You will capture either less or more than 100% of national income, which then raises lots of technical problems, biases, tax rates.
I get it. I still, as long as we're having the conversation about, making sure that we have effective measures, I don't think that really responds to the underlying concern about how you differentiate that. I understand that if you plus certain things up, if you leave them out, you're going to have less than 100%. If you count other things twice, that would be bad too, but that doesn't answer this central concern. I've got one more question in the small amount of time I've got remaining. In your peer-reviewed 2018 paper indicated that the top 1% of the top 1% saw its tax rate fall between 1964 and 2014 by 1 percentage point. Your book, if I understand it correctly, now shows a drop of 20 points. Am I reading those wrong, or is there an inconsistency? If there is, which one's right?
So we constantly refine and improve our methods to incorporate new data and better techniques. So for that particular question, we changed the way that we allocate the corporate tax, because now we have a better understanding of how to do that conceptually.
Thank you.
Congressman Byer.
Thank you very much. When we talk about income inequality, I occasionally get the question, so what? Jeff Bezos has $110 billion, and my daughter makes $48,000, but she's not hungry, and she's maybe happier than he is. Dr. Boucher, you talked about why income inequality is bad for the economy. I'd love you to expand on the first point, which was that it obstructs the supply of talent, ideas, and capital. I had an economics professor who spent the last 10 years of his career trying to figure out why kids in the lowest quartile never applied to my alma mater, even though they're obviously, IQ is fairly randomly distributed. And you'd point out that far more important than a child's aptitude score is their parental income.
Yeah, there's a lot of great pieces of research that answer that so what question. One of the ones that I keep coming back to is work by Raj Chetty and a long list of co-authors that looks at the distribution of patents. So there's fascinating data on who gets a patent, who applies for a patent, and who gets one, and the person's income as an adult. And they also have data on that person's third grade math test scores and their parents' income when they were in third grade. So they find on the first, in the first cut, they find the obvious. Kids that do really good on those third grade math tests, much more likely to grow up and get a patent, become an inventor. But they also find that children from the top quartile, who are the children who get the top math scores, who are in the top income quartile, 4 times as likely to grow up and get a patent than other children. So income inequality has this really important effect on whether or not smart kids who otherwise could be innovators in our economy or contributing in a variety of ways are moving their way up. Now, there's a lot of different hypotheses and research on why those kids aren't moving up. Is it because they're living in different communities and they don't see opportunity? Is it because they can't get a student loan? Is it because they don't graduate from high school, again, because of a bad neighborhood? So there's a lot of different policy interventions, but what is important to note is that there is something peculiar about a society where you have the rungs of the income ladder further and further apart that makes it really difficult for people to move up. And so where the research keeps coming back to is that indicator of inequality is something in and of itself that we need to address above and beyond all of the kinds of micro policy interventions that we might take to help that one child succeed.
I want to keep building on your second point, because one of the things that we struggle with all the time is how incredibly polarized the American public is, especially over politics. And as a Democrat, I'm always trying to understand the core 40% that's very, very loyal to our president. And there's some interesting essays in the last couple of weeks about people who have felt so left out of the economy, they just want to burn the house down. The notion of the chaos theory. And your second point is you talk about the fundamental institutions being distorted by this, that economic inequality gives people disproportionate political influence, laws, regulations, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this question is actually why I'm so passionate about this data that we're talking about here today, because we have not connected the dots that so many communities have been left behind. And because we aren't faced with that information every quarter, we're not searching for solutions to get at it. I fear that it's been 40 years where we know that it's been 40 years where income inequality has been rising, but we haven't focused on making sure that we're bringing all those people forward. And so now in 2019, you've got communities where people are like, yeah, we haven't seen economic growth, we haven't seen vitality, people are ignoring us. And I think, and being in this town for 20 years, it's because we haven't seen it. So, I mean, just to sort of bring it back to today's hearing, seeing that, I think, can help us open up the doors to all of the different solutions that we need to take to make sure that we are including people in our economy. Because the reality is that the data available shows that we aren't. And it's everything from the lack of jobs available to what we're doing in terms of investments in education and everything in between. But that reality that some communities are being left behind and policymakers haven't taken the steps to forge that comprehensive agenda seems to be at the core of a lot of this polarization. But I'm an economist, so I'm always going to read economics into politics.
But I sometimes wonder if I lived in a very disadvantaged rural community that had seen no growth whatsoever, that I might be drawn to a Make America Great message also.
Yeah.
I yield back.
Congressman Swikert.
Thank you, and I'll try to stay off the hook this time. Dr. Zwick, a question I've had, and I've actually hunted for credible information on it. What's the size of the underground economy?
In the United States.
Just the United States?
So it's a little bit outside my lanes. My understanding is it's smaller than it is in other developing countries, but I don't actually know the size.
And where I go with that is many years ago, when I was a much younger man, one of the projects we were assigned is try to take individuals in our community and model not their income, but their consumption, what they had. And look, this was undergraduate, so it wasn't particularly brilliant math, but we had consumption double what we believed the very households we looked at's income. And that was just really hard to say, were they just brilliant in their consumption? Were there things we didn't understand? Were there, because just if that's in 2 or 3 of the lowest quartiles, that sort of distortion, it lets you start to understand what's wrong in our sample data. What are we not understanding? I had many years later, some experiences when I was the treasurer for a very, very large county and doing the taxes, collections, and all those things, and realizing some of the things didn't seem to line up, where, you know, the value of the home, this and that, didn't match what we thought we knew about the household.
If I may, Congressman, briefly, just one of the open questions in this measuring inequality literature is how we distribute the underreported or unreported income. So one of my suggestions on expanding an audit program that would help us measure the underground economy and think about its distribution, how it's distributed relative to the income we do observe, actually, I think could be quite helpful and speak directly to your question.
Wouldn't a more elegant, at least, test from your income inequality would be a consumption model? Just to sort of, because that would let you know that there's something distortive, and see if that same distortion from 30 years ago still exists, because, and also, and help you understand, because it would really give you some great targeting information. Why are some communities, and where, this is where I was heading, and it would be for Doug Holtz-Eakin, we see entrepreneurial, you know, some of our ethnic populations, some of our communities, some of the education, those things have clusters of entrepreneurship that seems to be what creates tremendous amount of that velocity. And I've always wondered how I could sort of identify why and where. It's, I mean, we're often see that the fastest movement for really moving out of lower quartiles is actually some type of entrepreneurship.
So before we leave the observations on consumption, there has been lots of very good work, and I'd point to Bruce Meyer and his various co-authors looking at consumption-based measures of poverty. And they do, in fact, paint a different picture than the conventional income-based measures of poverty. The level of poverty is lower. There has been diminished poverty, but it doesn't change the fact that we still have some pressing poverty problems. But I'd suggest that to you. On the entrepreneurship, this is fascinating. So one of the best test cases and interesting phenomenons is immigrants. Immigrants to the United States are disproportionately entrepreneurial. They start businesses at a higher rate than the native-born population. And in some cases, they have sort of pooled finance as an immigrant community. They will sort of develop the financing mechanisms. And you can take countries in Asia in particular, Southeast Asia, and look at their performance in the U.S., and they're dramatically different rates of native entrepreneurship when they arrive in the U.S. Very small differences in culture. And so it's not just the economic circumstances that sort of determines this.
Does that make an argument if we desperately wanted to help a community that has suffered, that some of what is in there is better education, better this, but also an entrepreneurship of starting the plumbing or the food truck or whatever, you know, even if it's a level of microfinance?
It's Professor Zwick's job to grow new entrepreneurs. I would argue we should just have as few barriers to them as possible.
Well, and maybe in many ways, that's one of the discussions we have a lot, particularly in Arizona, is can you make it not scary? A single stop to get a permit, to get a license, to get this, to get that. So, because in many ways, it's a knowledge barrier that keeps these things from actually happening. And so, Madam Vice Chairman, thank you.
Congressman Heck.
Thank you. Maybe next to Fed policy that revs my motor is housing policy. So I want to begin by asking if any of you have either studied the issue of the relationship between home ownership and wealth inequality, or have a working knowledge of other people's work in this regard.
I've studied homeownership over a number of years, especially tax policy toward homeownership.
So, good, thank you. Let me lay out my construct and then just have you react to it. Home ownership is falling, especially among millennials. It's fully 15% lower than the generation of 30 and 60 years ago, even when excluding those who are still living upstairs or downstairs. And what we know about homeownership is that while consumer preferences are changing, it is still a commonly held aspiration of this country. We know that it is, on average, the #1 net worth building tool for Americans. And we know that to defer homeownership is to squeeze down the value at the end of that journey. My favorite expression, when I'm not citing another favorite expression, is the two most powerful forces on the face of the earth are the status quo and compound interest. And with the longer term home ownership you have, the more compounded interest you have, as it were, which obviously affects people's retirement security. It affects what it is they're able to bequeath to their offspring. Obviously, it also disproportionately affects those who are unable to capture that first rung on the ladder. So like everything else, low-income people are disproportionately impacted by deferred home ownership or lack of access to home ownership. So I guess there's my construct. There are a lot of reasons to explain what's happening. That's not our purpose here today. But I would appreciate some reflection on just this general construct.
I think it's a complicated area. It's a really good question. The first thing I would just politely disagree with a little bit is
Careful.
I was I'm aware, sir. I was in the White House in 2001, 2002, and there was a heavy emphasis on getting minority homeownership up, pushing. The instruments by which we typically push are subsidies to the debt portion of the homeownership acquisition. That continued on a relatively bipartisan basis right into the Great Recession, and we wiped out the wealth of a lot of minority America. So I'm more skeptical than some about the automatic wealth-building aspects of homeownership. We have some history that suggests people might want to be cautious about, especially people who are young who just looked at that. They're concerned about it. So that's sort of number one. Number two, there are.
Stop. That's an argument about what's the best way to go about solving the problem statement.
I also agree with that, yes.
It's not an argument about any of the things I laid out in my construct, because I didn't offer a solution. In fact, if I were to offer a solution, I'd go back to the last discussion we had, which is the best way to increase home ownership overall is get people's incomes up so they can afford it. But there are a lot
That's
of
what I
other
was going to
inputs.
say next, so I agree with that.
Okay.
But I think there are
Is it a material
consequences.
factor in wealth inequality, or is it becoming one?
It was a very material factor in the rise in wealth inequality in the Great Recession because the bottom disappeared. They lost their wealth. There's no question about it. It has consequences, knock-on consequences. So, for example, lots of entrepreneurs use the equity in their home as the way to finance things. So, how big is that right now? I don't know, but it's a phenomenon. In terms of things that can be done, probably most of the important levers are at the state and local level, where land use restrictions, zoning, and things like that are making some things just too expensive. And the restrictions on the supply are a big concern. And that's something that could be dealt with by states and localities.
And you say that as somebody who's actually studied the relationship between tax
Yeah.
policy and home ownership. Our purpose here today is not to argue, well, maybe it is, the specific solutions to the problem statement I laid out, but I would push back very considerably on your notion that the federal government does not have a significant role to play in this, be it tax policy or how, you said the major.
To be clear, it has a major role. I just
Okay.
don't like the way it's executed that. I would rather see, for example,
Okay,
you want to get
let's
someone
come
a
up with
home,
something better.
have a new homeowner tax credit instead of, hey, get a big mortgage.
But get
That's not a
something
good
that
message.
enables more people.
Right.
All right, we're good. I yield back. Thank you, Madam Vice Chair. Thank you. This has been a very spirited conversation, and I want to go back to how you were measuring wealth. I'm a former teacher and a former social worker, and I worked in incredibly poor neighborhoods in New York. And I've worked with families that they had significant social transfers from the state, living on welfare,
subsidized housing and public housing. We have 700,000 families in public housing, subsidized housing in New York. The WIC program, which is food for children, fuel. We have these programs where the fuel is subsidized, and many food programs. And even before Obamacare in New York City, the health care of the poor is taken care of. Anybody who's sick is taken care of in our public hospitals. So that's a significant amount of support that is going to a family. Are you measuring that in your numbers?
Yes, thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Yes, we do in our work, distributional national accounts, we do allocate all government spending, including monetary transfers, in-kind transfers such as health spending on Medicare, Medicaid, and also spending on public goods like education, like police, like defense, everything. We take all forms of government spending that we distribute to that we allocate to the entire population, just like we do for taxes. We do the exact same thing comprehensively for government transfers. And when you do that, what you see is that the US government does redistribute resources. It is overall, redistributive, of course. And what I want to stress again is that, it's hard to allocate many forms of government spending. Who benefits from defense spending?
Everyone.
Some people believe that wealthy benefit more from defense spending. That is arguable. It's hard.
Well,
it's not for us to say.
9/11 attacked everyone in the vicinity. It didn't
So
benefit anyone.
I totally agree that, and that's the way we do it. The way we allocate it is we allocate it to everyone. But what I want to say is that these are difficult questions, are difficult choices to make, and these choices are better made by government statisticians,
I need to read your book.
by government agencies,
have another hearing.
than by academics. We hope that our little prototype is going to be taken over, is going to be done by government statisticians and improved. It can be improved in many ways.
I'd now like to yield to call on Mr. Lee. And
I didn't want to end this hearing without giving you a chance to talk to us about the concept of tax competition and whether or not you think we are in a vulnerable position as a result of it. What worries you about tax competition?
Tax competition is very real, and it drove the structure of the corporate reforms in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, because those mimic what has happened across the OECD in the movement away from worldwide systems. The reality is that it is impossible to identify where and when a dollar is earned around the globe, and to try to tax it in the U.S. at that moment is a virtually impossible job. So we've moved toward, I think, a realistic positioning of ourselves in the competitive world for the moment. The rates in the middle of the developed country world, 21%. The base is more like one we would have, and it better positions our companies to compete internationally, and that's good for the workers, and that ultimately is the objective. I don't think that'll stay still. Like when we did the 1986 reforms, we had the lowest corporate rate in the developed world, and we were way behind by the time 2017 rolled around. I expect the rest of the world to keep moving. We'll have to just see where we are competitively.
okay. I thank everybody. It's really been incredibly interesting. Economic inequality is a major challenge facing this country. It is not good for the rich, it's not good for the poor, it's not good for the country overall. And we need to do a better job measuring inequality, tracking it, and most importantly, addressing it. So I am really very grateful to all of you for your research and for what you shared with us today. You gave us a lot of good insights on a very critical issue. Thank you so much. We are adjourned. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
This was interesting. You always ask such good questions. Whose book is this?
Yes, ma'am. It belongs to the committee staff.
Okay, I'm going to get him to. I'm going to get him to. Zuckman to sign it.
You can have it if you like, and Zuckman will sign
I'll
it.
take it, I'll get him to sign it. I'll have him sign it to the committee staff. Mr. Zuckman. It's very interesting. I have to read your book. I